Good morning, everyone, and welcome. My name is Artemis Kirk, University Librarian, and it's a great pleasure to see so many people here, and to tell you also that we are live streaming as we speak, and many of our colleagues from our Doha campus in Qatar are here as well. Welcome to you all. It's a great pleasure for me to introduce the person who will give you introductions to our esteemed panelists today. But before I do, I would like to thank a number of people who have put together this wonderful, now maybe 15th or 20th Scholarly Communication Symposium over the years. First, I'd like to thank Jenny Smith and Grace McKinney from the Laurinburg Library staff, who have done all of the events planning and programming and provided us with these lovely refreshments. From our Gillardin New Media Center, Amy Richards and David Hagan are working both with a still camera and with our streaming folks to bring everybody else this presentation, so we thank you for that. And I really want to thank the Scholarly Communications Committee for putting together what promises to be an extraordinarily important and interesting program today. Richard Brown from the Georgetown Press, who will be the moderator, Laura Bishop, the Kennedy School of Ethics, Kennedy Institute of Ethics, I'm sorry, Meg Oakley from the Laurinburg Library, Bill Olson, also Laurinburg, Charles Sargent, the Office of Scholarly Publications, Ken Scott, who is our Qatar representative, Morgan Stoddard from the Georgetown Law Library, and Yana Vovidis from Kendall's. So, Altmetrics. All kinds of metrics are things that people are looking to now to assess and to evaluate the outcomes of faculty productivity. How these metrics are used, how they've been used in the past, how they should be used in the present and might be in the future are things that I expect our panelists will talk about. It's a great pleasure to introduce my colleague, the director of the Georgetown University Press and a member of the Scholarly Communications Committee, Richard Brown, who will take this program. Okay.
Thank you, Artemis. It's great to see everyone here, a lot of friendly faces from Georgetown and beyond. Welcome here. For those of you who are in Doha, Ahlan wa Sahlan, welcome. Good to have you here. I really want to thank Meg Oakley. Artemis has thanked her, but Meg was really the driver of this event and of all of these events we have with the Scholarly Communications Committee. So Meg, thank you. Artemis mentioned the goal of this symposium is to talk about scholarly metrics and to learn about scholarly metrics and also the role scholarly metrics should play in evaluating scholarly impact. We have three outstanding panelists to help us do that. Before I go on, I want to mention that due to an illness in her family, Vice Provost Adriana Kugler is not able to join us today. We miss her, but we want to extend our deep gratitude to Jacques Berlinerblau, Professor of Jewish Civilization at Georgetown, who has agreed to join us on the panel. Jacques, thank you. We owe you one. Before I go further, let me mention that there is a wonderful resource for all of us and everyone at Georgetown and beyond that is now available titled Measuring Research Impact. It's a handout, and Meg, I know it's available online.
And also in the program materials on the front desk. So if you didn't get one on your way in, please pick it up on your way out.
I want to thank John Kimbrough, a Laurinburg librarian who prepared that. So please take advantage of that. Let me run through how things will work today. Each panelist will speak for roughly 20 minutes, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions and answers and discussions. Questions not only from the group in this immediate area, but also from those of you in Qatar and those of you who are coming into us remotely. I ask that you hold your questions until all of the panelists have finished speaking, Please introduce yourself and try to speak clearly and project. If you have a question and you're squeamish about asking the question, I will be sitting in the second row, and you can sidle up to me and hand off a little piece of paper if you want me to ask the question. I'm happy to do that. Everything sound okay so far? Okay, good. One reason why I think this panel will be really, really interesting is that we will have three different perspectives on the issue of metrics and altmetrics. Librarian perspective, a scholar from information science, and then someone from Georgetown, Jock Berliner-Blau, who is on the rank and tenure committee. So we want to see how this really pays off. I mean, what's it mean to talk about metrics, altmetrics, in terms of one's scholarly career? One perspective you will not hear much about today is the publisher's perspective. I know that's disappointing to many of you. But I can't resist just mentioning one thing as a publisher that I think is really significant for our world, and I know there are a couple of publishers in the audience, and maybe you can appreciate this as well. I want to read a few lines to you from the Georgetown Marketing Author Questionnaire, which I think has some bearing on altmetrics. So here's what we send out to all of our authors after we've contracted, but before we've published their book. I'm reading from the document. GUP maintains an active web and social media presence, and we will link to your site, retweet, or reblog as appropriate to promote your title. Now, here we're talking about books. Do you maintain an author or professional website to which we can link your book? If so, please provide the URL. We encourage authors who have decided to set up a new website to create one that focuses on the author as an expert, rather than just one for the new book. You have a professional Facebook page. You have a blog. You have a Twitter account. List any other social media platforms that might be active for you as a professional. Georgetown University Press has a social media account in the following: Facebook, Goodreads, Library Thing, LinkedIn, Pinterest, Tumblr, Twitter, YouTube, on and on and on. You know the saying, if it's not online, it doesn't exist? I wonder if we're heading to a place where if an author is not online, if an author doesn't have a social media presence, she may not exist. That's enough of my perspective. Let me introduce you to the experts. I'm going to introduce all three speakers first, and then they'll come up and speak. So our first speaker will be Rachel Borchardt. She's the science librarian at American University's Bender Library. Prior to coming to American, she was biology and neuroscience and behavior biology librarian at Emory University in Atlanta. She is the co-author of a new book, Meaningful Metrics, the 21st Century Librarian's Guide to Bibliometrics, Altmetrics, and Research Impact, published by the Association of College and Research Libraries. She's a graduate of Oberlin, and she holds an MLIS from the University of Pittsburgh. And she will provide an introduction to metrics and altmetrics. Rachel, it's good to have you here. Professor Blaise Cronin came in from Indiana. Thank you, Blaise. He's Professor Emeritus of Information Science at Indiana University Bloomington and Editor-in-Chief of the Journal of the American Society for Information Science. Much of his research focuses on collaboration in science, scholarly communication, citation analysis, the academic reward system, and cybermetrics, the intersection of science and social studies of science. He's the co-author of two recent books on metrics, Beyond Bibliometrics, Harnessing Multidimensional Indicators of Scholarly Impact, and Scholarly Metrics Under the Microscope, from citation analysis to academic auditing. In 2006, he received the Award of Merit from the American Society for Information Science and Technology, the Society's highest honor. Professor Cronin has an MA from Trinity College Dublin, and holds the PhD and DSSC from Queen's University Belfast. In 1997, he was awarded the degree of Doctor of Letters by Queen Margaret University College in Edinburgh. for his scholarly contributions to information science. In 2013, he received the Derek DeSolo Prize Award and Medal for outstanding contributions to the field of quantitative studies of science. Professor Cronin's presentation is titled "A Fetish Too Far? Altmetrics in the Groves of Academia." That's provocative. And last and certainly not least, Professor Jacques Berliner-Blau is Professor of Jewish Civilization at Georgetown, Director of the Program for Jewish Civilization, and was recently appointed to the University Committee on Rank and Tenure. He's currently writing a book with this great title, "Professed and Confessed: Notes from the Academy as professors publish, perish, and neglect their students." Not you, Jacques. Sure. To be published by that really interesting publishing house, Melville House. He has published on a wide variety of issues ranging from the composition of the Hebrew Bible to the sociology of heresy to modern Jewish intellectuals to African American and Jewish American relations. He's published 5 books, the most recently being How to Be Secular, a Call to Arms for Religious Freedom, in addition to numerous articles in leading scholarly journals. Professor Berliner-Blau holds 2 doctorates, one in ancient Near Eastern languages and literatures from New York University, and a second in sociology from the New School for Social Research. And Jacques will discuss how metrics might be considered when determining the quality of scholarship under Georgetown's new guidelines for submission of rank and tenure applications. So that's the panel. Looking forward to this. And Rachel, you'll lead us off.
Good morning. First off, thank you to Georgetown and to Scholarly Communications Committee for having me. It's a pleasure to be here, and I get the lovely view. It's great to be on this side of the podium. So I'm here just to provide the background. There we go. So that we're all on the same page as we start to get into the more meat of what metrics mean. We'll start with, why do we use metrics? In a nutshell, it's a way to measure research impact. One of the main things to realize is that no measurement is ever going to be perfect, but it is one that has become commonly accepted in academia. It's a way that we differentiate at the article level, the journal level, the author level, and even at the institutional level. But ultimately, we're trying to measure something that can't really be measured. So kind of a fuzzy concept. So we're doing the best we can when it comes to metrics. Metrics, as we've kind of already hinted at with the other speakers, are used in a variety of purposes for measuring researchers as they go to take a new job or when they go to be promoted, as Jacques will talk about, when they go to get grant funding. And we also use it to benchmark institutions against each other as well as programs. So those are just some of the uses. And the picture is actually from the AU Faculty Manual, which now stresses the impact of publications that needs to be demonstrated in order to get tenure and promotion. This is actually a fairly recent change for AU, where it used to just say publishing in national and international venues, rather than demonstrating national and international impact. That word, impact, comes up a lot. So what are metrics? That's the main thing I'm here to talk about. We've got kind of 2 main flavors of metrics. The traditional bibliometrics is what we'll start with, and then the new kid on the scene, altmetrics. The main thing to know about bibliometrics, the basic building block, are citations. So when a researcher cites another researcher in their bibliography, there are ways to track those citations and count them and create all sorts of measures based on those citations. So I'm going to take you on a quick and hopefully not too boring view of how we create those measures based on citations. So in the beginning, impact factor was the first major metric to appear. It was created by a man called Eugene Garfield in the 1950s. And my fun fact is that journal impact factor was originally created for librarians to assess their collections and consider adding or removing materials from their collection. So it actually wasn't intended primarily to measure research impact per se. It is owned by a company called Thomson Reuters, and they publish it in Journal Citation Reports, which is a database that can be subscribed to. Impact factor itself, the formula is at the bottom. It's a little funky, but it is a 3-year measurement that the best broad way to think of it is as an average number of citations per article in the journal for a specific time period. So our articles are published in the journal, and then we count the number of citations that result from those journal articles and average by the number of articles that have been published, and that's how we produce impact factor. Okay. But a raw number is often not all that telling. So one of the ways that impact factor is used is to then rank impact factors according to specific subjects. So I can, within journal citation reports on the long left-hand side, this is kind of the snapshot. I chose political science to show you as a subject heading, and then the top 10 journals ranked by impact factor on the right-hand side. This is how we start to create some context to the raw impact factor numbers, which otherwise are kind of just a number, right? So a question I often get is, what is a good impact factor? This is one way to start to determine that, is to rank it with other like journals in that field. Impact factor is not the only journal level metric that exists. It was the only one for a long time. There are 2 other major metrics. There are many, many more that we don't have time to talk about, but 2 of the others. SJR is created by an independent research group out of the Netherlands. And the H5 index is created by a Google Scholar because Google's in everything. Why wouldn't they be in metrics? They use slightly different calculations, all with the same aim of trying to measure this journal level quality. SJR, probably the easiest way to talk about it is to compare it to the Google algorithm, where the more times an article or a journal is cited, the more heavily weighted it becomes. So it's kind of an advanced version of that average that we saw with impact factor. H5 index is, we'll talk a bit more when we talk about author level metrics, but it's another way to calculate journal quality. So SJR and H5 are actually both available for free. Yay. And one important thing to know that the base data from which all these are being calculated are slightly different. So one of the big factors that comes into play is what journals are actually being indexed to count those citations. So different journals are indexed to create these 3 metrics. So there is no one data set that's producing all of these metrics. And I think that's an important consideration because it's a major constraint. So this is what the categories look like for SJR and H5. On the left is political science and international science. So it's going to look a little different. On the right is political science. I always like to show this just because I find it very interesting at how much individual journals can move up and down within these rankings. I chose social sciences for a reason. One of the big things about impact factor, about bibliometrics, is that they were primarily created for the sciences, who have a very heavy citation culture. They produce a lot of articles as compared to other disciplines. So if we were looking at, say, chemistry, it may look a little more even as compared to something like political science, which can have some more wild movement. All right, so author level metrics. So this is not looking at the individual journal level, but at all of the publications a single author produces in their career. The main metric that is used is the H index. I will try and explain it. The H index stands for a number H, which is the number of publications that an author has produced that have each been cited H or more times. So an H index of, say, 5 means that an author has produced 5 articles with 5 or more citations each. If they then produce a 6th article that got 6 citations along with the other 5 that had gotten 6 or more, then that H index would rise from 5 to 6. Crazy, right? So this is really designed to measure quality over time. And as you may have guessed, this works much better in the STEM disciplines. again, because they are publishing so frequently. This is very much a senior level metric. I would not expect to use it for someone who has been published, say, in a 5-year period, because it's just not going to be very meaningful at that point. One of the fun things about citations is that they take time to accrue, right? So the longer the publishing history, the higher those numbers get, and the more we can make calculations like the H index based on them. Oh, actually, one thing that I forgot to say, those same data sets that are driving the journal impact factors, the SJIR, also produce the H index. So they tend to come up with different H indexes based on the citations that they're tracking through those journals. So a true H index may not be reflected in any of the 3 sources because they are all gathering citations from different sources. So you may have to put some more effort in combining all of those citations together to get a true H index. So some criticisms with Google metrics. There are many, as you may have already guessed. One of the big issues is that citations are just citations. They don't really say anything about the relative quality of the journal, just that it's being cited for some reason. We would have to dig a bit deeper to know exactly why something is being cited, right? We can have a retracted journal with 200 citations, and it's still 200 citations, which sounds pretty impressive, even though the article's been retracted. Another issue is that certain types of articles tend to receive higher citation counts. Review articles are the most notable example. But I can say from personal experience that publishing on hot topics, like Altmetrics, tends to get you more citations. So there are a lot of kind of cultural factors that come into play when we're talking about that citation count that you may not think of when you're just looking at a raw number on a screen. As I mentioned before, applying this to different disciplines, your results may vary. Even within the sciences, it's going to depend on those subject categories and how well they do at describing the discipline within a researcher or a scientist is working. So sometimes there can be some comparisons between 2 sub-disciplines that all get merged together that have very different citation cultures, right? This could be a book-heavy sub-discipline, and this one could be an article-heavy sub-discipline, but they all get merged together into one subject category that isn't well reflected in rankings. As I said, citations are based on that index, which is a major limitation. Some of the categories are very broad, especially outside of the sciences. And ultimately, we're making very big decisions based on very limited data, in this case, citations, right? So these are all issues, and the picture at the bottom is one of my favorites. Eugene Garfield, the person who created impact factor, now spends a good deal of his time writing about why we shouldn't be using it. Wonderful. So he's a big, important name to this day in the field. So, enter Altmetrics. Obviously, something more can be done and has been done. So what are Altmetrics? The more or less official definition, the creation and study of new metrics based on the social web for analyzing and informing scholarship. And that comes from the Altmetrics Manifesto, which was created in 2010. My personal definition, which I find a bit easier to explain and grasp, is the umbrella classification of non-citation-based metrics. So it's essentially anytime we can get numbers that is saying something about some scholarship that's being produced as it moves its way through online tools, as people discuss it and share it and save it, all of those wonderful things. Altmetrics itself is a term that was coined in 2010 by Jason Prian through Twitter. So this is the actual origin of the term Altmetrics, which I think really well encapsulates kind of the 21st century feel of the term. So where do these Altmetrics come from? The answer is a lot of places. So these logos are kind of a small sampling of different sites and tools where we can get Altmetrics from. So for example, from Amazon, if a book is published, we can get sales information about that book and also how that book is selling compared to others in its field. Or in ResearchGate, which is a scholarly network, if a researcher uploads an article or a citation, to their article. We can see every time it is viewed and downloaded and discussed within that network. So a variety of people that are using these things in a variety of ways. So far beyond citations, right? How we collect these metrics really depends. There's a number of ways to collect them, starting directly from those tools that we saw. I can go to Amazon.com and get my own book sales from day to day, an hour to hour, even if I want to. I really want to. Some publishers do make views and downloads of articles available directly through their website, as do some databases are starting to include this type of information. Scholarly networks, as I mentioned, that are specifically for researchers, and even some that are more general, like Facebook, like Twitter. And finally, we have tools that can aggregate all of these different metrics together and start presenting them in one unified base. And we'll take a look at some of those tools. But just to show you the pictures, up at the top right, we have SlideShare. This is one of my presentations from day to day of how many views those slides have received, and I can pull that directly from slideshare.net. On the lower left is PLOS, Public Library of Science, which makes article level metrics available for all of their articles. And you can see it actually includes citations as well as views and downloads. And next to that is actually Web of Science has recently introduced something called usage counts. So not just citations, which we see, this is the citations as well as the usage for 2 articles, but how many times that article has been downloaded or saved to EndNote within the past 180 days. So that's something they added within the past month or so. Next we have is ResearchGate. Those are all of my publications and their views and downloads. Not very impressive, I know. And in the bottom right is one of the aggregating tools. So how do we categorize all of these disparate metrics? There is no one way to categorize them now. All of the different tools have kind of developed their own systems for categorization. So we can see one categorization style here: view, cited, discussed, save, recommend. But the idea is that we're taking different types of metrics and finding commonalities in between them. How are people engaging with this scholarship? In what ways? Well, then the other one specifically separates between public and scholarly engagement with these works, which I find to be a very relevant way to categorize. So, very quickly talk about the major altmetrics tools, since it's probably not the main reason we're all here. There are 3 major ones that exist right now. Altmetric, which has a number of products, Impact Story, and PlumX. Altmetric, their main thing that they provide is called the Altmetric badge, and the Altmetric donut is the actual colored wheel that they provide. This is provided for virtually anything with a DOI. So it tracks metrics based on DOI, and that's kind of an important thing to remember. Something does not have a DOI, they don't have a way to trace it. But as it moves through these different spheres, it'll tell you the metrics for each individual place where they're tracking metrics and give you a central score. So that's that number inside of the donut, which is designed to be directly compared to other similar research products. You can also see along the right, within those individual categories, not only are they bringing together metrics, but they're starting to provide some context to what these numbers mean. So you can see, it'll say, for example, how this article compares to all other articles that were published in Nature and for that year, and in Nature for that year. So again, going from the raw into the context. Impact Story is created for authors as a kind of online supplement to their CV. So this is an example of what it looks like, and then they get tags of green and blue for that public and scholarly engagement of their different works in different categories. This is available via subscription for, I believe, $60 a year. The Altmetric, depending on the product, but their basic badge that can be looked at for individual articles is free. And finally, we have PlumX, which is an institutional level tool. So it's really designed to provide metrics and context at a very high level. University of Pittsburgh was one of the first to implement it. So we can see they actually work with researchers on their campus to add their research profiles, and then can group groups of researchers by lab, by department, etc., to view all of their metrics at once. But we see for individual products in the lower right, they're also providing the same metrics as everyone else. So the major theme, they're all harvesting data and making it available. So some benefits to Altmetrics, I've kind of hinted at, but we have new ways to measure that don't rely on citations and can provide a natural or unnatural, depending on what the other speakers say, complement to existing bibliometrics. One of the things I like most is that it does provide data for very recent publications. As I said, citations can take time to generate. That's something that can widely vary from field to field. One of the most extreme examples being mathematics, where it can take upwards of 30 years for an article to receive attention, but we can at least now see when people are viewing and downloading that article, even if they haven't cited it. It does go beyond the traditional scholarly impact into more public measures of engagement, which I think is an important distinction to make and something that we couldn't look at before. And finally, this can go beyond the journal article. I mentioned DOIs work specifically with Altmetric, but in Hextory, I can put anything with the URL that can be tracked by that URL. So the reason I got involved with this in the first place was I used to create a podcast for librarians, and it was very difficult to track what the impact of that podcast was. So I started using Altmetrics to see how are people posting this into, say, online courses, or are they talking about it on their blogs? So that was how I measured my impact. And I think that that's an important distinction because scholarly communication is changing. Scholars are talking with each other and communicating in a variety of venues. Journal articles are only one venue. Some limitations. One of the big questions, are we talking about impact? Do Altmetrics measure impact? I'm not sure if anyone has the answer for that. Most of the products that are available are very careful to call it attention or engagement, but the role that Altmetrics plays in measuring that big fuzzy picture of research impact is relatively unknown, and everyone's got their own ideas about it. One of the big questions that people often ask is how do we avoid gaming, which is a big issue. At what point does it stop being a researcher promoting their own work and start being someone who is artificially inflating scores for Altmetrics? And some of the tools are trying to work at eliminating things like bots that can make Altmetrics appear at a very unnaturally high rate. But finding that balance between natural and unnatural metrics is very tricky. Just like with bibliometrics, this all relies on people actually using and engaging with these materials online. And we've seen that there can be some disciplinary differences when it comes to who is online, who is looking at this content. So it depends on the tool. We don't really have time to talk about it now, but those disciplinary differences definitely do still exist with bibliometrics and with Altmetrics. And as I alluded to, we need ways to actually track all of this research consistently, or else the numbers become almost meaningless. So DOIs being one of those primary ways that we can track these materials. But that means that everything has to have the DOI. So very quickly, because my time's running out, some things that are happening now in Altmetrics. NISO, the National Information Standards Organization, has 3 working groups that's working on standardizing some aspects of Altmetrics. I happen to work on the definition and case uses group, so I can bring you some sample, what may end up being case use categories. This is about a week old, and we're currently discussing it in our committee. But right now we've identified 3 broad categories of use. Research assessment, note, not impact. Showcasing achievements and discovery. So we see these all as potential uses for Altmetrics. But we also have 2 other committees that are looking at standardizing the data and the methodology behind Altmetrics. Lots of research happening all the time, looking at how these different disciplines work with Altmetrics and what are some of those disciplines as it gets impacted. in those actual metrics, as well as correlating different types of metrics with each other. On the right-hand side was one of the first correlation studies done by Jason Cream, the guy who invented Altmetrics, and Heather Pirouar from Altmetrics in the wild, that found that one of the highest correlations is between PDF downloads and citations with a correlation rate of about 0.6. But it's also been found that there are some disciplinary differences, of course. And in terms of some current usage, there are some committees, I actually meant to change this, the NSF now asks for evidence of broader impact for people who are recipients of their grant. Obviously, that is a really good case for using Altmetrics because they're really asking to go beyond scholarly impact. And really, the other speakers will talk about some of these other uses, so I don't really have to. And with that, thank you, and I turn it over to the ladies.
A no-brainer, you might say, but actually these days we don't actually use our brains, not as much as we used to. We tend to rely upon rankings, ratings, score sheets, metrics, and indicators, even though many of those metrics and indicators, as I think most of us know in our hearts, are either dubious in terms of the validity, questionable in terms of the reliability, and no less dubious in terms of the potential utility. Mr. Bieber, if we're going to go by the numbers, is going to, I'm afraid, outperform old Ludwig. He has a mere 65.9 million followers. He has 72 million people who like him on Facebook. And I come up with the term Biebermetrics as a subcategory of bibliometrics. For anyone who has any doubt as to who is primus inter pares in the world of music, historically and contemporaneously, there, of course, is the answer, or not. There, here. and this makes a very good point. It brings it to light. One should actually engage with, read, in the case of articles and papers and monographs, and in the case of other cultural pursuits, perhaps look at, listen to, and analyze the sophistication, the originality, the creativity, etc., of the works in question. So terribly inconvenient, it's much easier to rely upon metrics. Now you can say that this is, of course, naive. You can't compare Beethoven with Bieber, or indeed Bieber with Beethoven, apples and oranges. And indeed, you can't compare Beethoven with Mozart, and you can't compare Diana Krall with Miles Davis, or you could, but you won't get very far. Those apples are not apples, they're quite often different kinds of apples. And this gets down to the point again that Rachel made. It's not just a matter of comparing at a disciplinary, at the field or the subfield level. In my own relatively small field of information science, there are 3, 4, 5 quite separate major groups of research, which are largely non-communicating, non-interacting, but all extremely important. You cannot compare someone who's a specialist in information retrieval with someone who's a specialist in knowledge categorization or classification theory. And yet, it is very difficult not to do because pressure is on us to try and identify whether Dr. Bieber is in fact more worthy of promotion or recruiting than Dr. Beethoven. And this is what we do. It's a 19th century redux. We are trying to measure that which is in fact very often beyond measure. It wasn't I think, not I think, it wasn't Einstein in fact, but it was William Cameron who said, everything can be counted. Not everything can in fact be counted. And this is one of the problems. One is seduced by the array of metrics and the ease with which they can be applied and the deceptive credibility of the numbers and ratings and rankings that they give us. I'm going to say a few words, parenthetically almost, about publication, because the modes of publication and the number of genres of academic or quasi-academic publication are growing quite rapidly. And this I simply show that a typical scholar, say in humanities, or the social sciences, the softer social sciences, may have a matrix of outputs that are more or less scholarly substantial, more or less scholarship-like, and which are subjected to different intensities of peer review. And we have to understand that scholars in some fields produce a multiplicity of outputs. We came up with the term biobibliometrics a few years ago. We actually looked at how, over time, and as academics moved through rank from assistant to full professor, how their outputs shifted and the emphasis changed on what they were producing. So we should not assume linearity, but all scholars will produce the same kinds of material at the same level, same intensity over time. We need much more nuanced ways of capturing the diversity of output at different points in a scholar's career. Classic bibliometrics, which I've worked in for more than 30 years, citations, as Rachel said, are the sort of gold standard, if you will, but they have the limitations, many, I could talk for hours on them, but they are lagged, and they only capture certain effects, consequences, impacts, whereas some of the new tools like Mendeley and so forth capture events in near real time or in real time. Now, what those events are, what they signify, what they denote are of course open to question. In the world of academic publishing, scholarship, we assess people based on what they produce, but the notion of an author, what Foucault called the author function, has changed really quite dramatically. And these days, in the world of scientific publication, and I include the harder ends of the social sciences, there isn't just an author, but we have multiple co-authors. In most fields, co-authorship is the norm. In the clinical science, medical sciences, in hierarchy physics, it is almost inconceivable that a paper could be produced with a single author. It is still, of course, the case in the humanities, but by and large, field by field is revealing a tendency towards multiple authorship, in some cases what we term hyper-authorship. And so we have co-authors, and it's a concept well documented and unfortunately quite prevalent of gift authorship, granting an important colleague or person or lab director authorial status that has been materially unearned. Conversely, and I found this in studies we ourselves have done, that individuals who did contribute to work, very often historically it's been females contributing in the lab, who are pushed into the background, remain in the shadowlands, and don't receive due credit where credit has been earned. And then, of course, we have the work of pharmaceutical companies where research is done, and academics are post hoc identified, whose names can then be affixed with their blessing to the paper in question to try and give it legitimacy. And then what we term sub-authorship collaboration, all of those names that appear in acknowledgements at the end of, in some fields, almost every published academic article. All those other individuals who didn't quite get a byline, but whose material contributions, significant, medium significant, or not so significant, were worth at least acknowledging. It's like let the credits roll at the end of a movie. If you look at a journal like Cell, for example, almost every paper will have a half a page identifying named individuals who made material, specific contributions to that study. Without which that study wouldn't be done, and yet they are not listed among the authors. So we have this an expanding category of sub-authorship collaboration. Just to give you an idea of the scale of multi-authorship, this is Web of Science, Thomson Reuters data, showing at one point it was explosive growth, now it's leveling off. In the number of articles with 50 plus, 100 plus, 200, 500, 1,000 plus articles. A couple of weeks ago there was an article in Nature, Scientific American, and elsewhere on the first paper to have more than 5,000 authors. It's inherently physics. This is a non-problematic construct in that world because it is a high, self-knowing, self-trusting community. There's no cheating going on. This is a fascinating thing about hierarchy physics, but that's for another day. The point is, 5,000 people didn't put pen to paper, 5,000 people didn't write a half a word each, yet they are still referred to, using this classic convention, as authors. I coined the term hyper-authorship back in 2001, and what happens is the number of hands involved in the crafting of a document, and not to mention the work that goes on behind that document, the contributions, the inputs shift from being textual in nature to being instrumental in one sense or another. And I'm exaggerating here for effect, but what we're seeing is a dramatic shift in some fields at least from the idea of a text as a a collection of words. I'm using text very generically here. A craft activity with the emphasis on narrative and sequence and word flow, to something that can be very data intensive, have software embedded, include visualizations, etc., etc. And so we're moving from the idea of the sole author to teams, collaborations, and in some fields, massive collaborations. There are and can be consequences. Rachel mentioned retraction. One thing we have seen as a result of the growth of hyper-authored papers is that responsibility, guarantorship is diffused, is spread among many people, less control. And one of the consequences of that is it is much more likely that fraud or accidental error will occur. So questions about public trust being undermined as a consequence of the notion of authorship being exploded and responsibility being scattered across everyone in the room such as this. Which is why organizations like the Wellcome Trust recently come forward with a set of guidelines to try and determine what contributorship is as opposed to authorship. I think it was Drummond Rennie, an associate editor of the American Journal of the American Medical Association, who recommended that, and I quote, "We retire the concept of author and replace it in certain fields, at least, with that of contributorship." And last week, the STM Publishers Group came out with this. We're going to give authors cute little tags to say exactly what they did in a paper. So Sarah did some data gathering, Freddie did some conceptual analysis, and Jimmy and John wrote the text up. And then you can collect these on your CV. And when Jack comes to look at you for promotability, these will be things that he will be counting and losing sleep over. Doc is an old friend of mine, and he is the founding father of what we today refer to as bibliometrics. We've moved way beyond publication counting and citation counting to more sophisticated tools, and both today and tomorrow we're going to see much, much more emphasis on these things called altmetrics. In the old days, what we said, well, your paper is good if it appears in a highly reputable journal like Nature. Your paper is good if it appears in a journal that's a high impact factor. You inherit the prestige of the journal, which of course is absolutely absurd reasoning. Your paper is good if it attracts a lot of citations, taking not into account whether those citations came from Nobel laureates or master students. Not all citations are equal, like all pigs. Persistence of citations, hot topic. We see, you could call it a priapic life curve. A subject attracts tremendous short-term attention and then dissipates, it fades, it ceases to be of interest. But you've attracted attention. Then there are Cinderella papers that can be lying low for 20, 30 years and slowly and belatedly accrue citations. So these are just some of the limitations. So now we have all of these other indicators: times downloaded, times assessed, times presumptively read. How often is a paper or book included in syllabi? How often are you mentioned in media, in public policy documents, and so on? It was indeed Jason Priam, still a doctoral student whom I know, who coined the term in 2010, altmetrics. I'd like to coin it, I didn't, but I like to think, and citations suggest that we can claim to have floated the idea back in 1998 when we published a paper called Invoked on the Web. And we looked at the different forms, the ways in which individuals are mentioned on the web, what those might tell us about the salience, the significance, the street credibility, if you like, of scholars. In other words, going beyond classic publication and citation methods to other indicators, under indications that people had somehow, we were back to Herbert Simon, the Nobel Prize winner, and he came up with the idea of an attention economy, people who have attracted attention. There's a big difference between buzz or attention, and yet here is what I'm going to see deans and provosts will in future have on their desks, as business executives do, toolkits like this, dynamically updating the number of citations, mentions, downloads, whatever it might be, of every faculty member on campus. And to his credit, Jason, Priam, and Heather did recognize that we and administrators need to ask whether altmetrics, in fact, do reflect something called impact, not just empty buzz. When we talk about the effects of research, there are short-term and long-term, immediate and delayed effects or impacts. Scholarly impact, professional impact, and social impact. work in, say, social public policy may not be necessarily highly cited, but may affect what happens in the world of work, in the world of public policy, the public domain. So there are different kinds of impact that are reflected in different ways over different time frames. A paper can be read, but not cited. A paper can be cited, but actually not have been read. And a paper can be read, but not used. Or a paper can be read and used, or a paper can be cited and not used. So in all of these things, it really gets quite complicated, trying to differentiate between buzz and significant scholarly impact. I'll skip all of that. Article level metrics, sort of things we saw, and Rachel put up a few examples from current services and platforms. Their appeal is that they are real time of the moment, they are multidimensional, and they're very easy to count. The downside, and this is where the socially questionable consequences of this cult of altmetrics is that they do encourage ego boosting. They do get us on a sort of, what do you call those things that rats go around in?
Hamster wheel.
Yeah, hamster wheel. And I suspect that they slowly begin to modify our behavior, that being recognized, attracting attention, being seen, maintaining our salience becomes as important as actually doing the work, as the ideas themselves. And hence the title of this paper. I do think that there are some potentially culturally corrosive consequences of it. Snap, you had a very similar slide. We did actually publish a paper in Nature last year. And so I was very pleased to see that we were, in this case, in the 99th percentile. This is playing to the author of that our paper, the egos. Actually, I went back and looked, and that paper has not been highly cited, despite the fact that it was published A in Nature, and B was in the, whatever it was, upper 99th percentage of most interesting, most attention-generating papers at the time. So these things have to be treated with a degree of caution. And this is where I think we tend to confuse two things, social capital and symbolic capital. Social capital is captured in how often does somebody like you, how much are you being tweeted, how often are people, how many people are following you, like Justin Bieber, how heavily blogged is your work, how many people are making comments about your posts, how often do people recommend your articles, your journal papers, your monographs, and how often does your name pop up in the New York Times or on Fox News or wherever it might be. Useful way of grouping these, not mine, of grouping different kinds of altmetrics, those that have to deal with the top left quadrant, social activity, the liking, the tweeting, the playing on ego, immediacy, mass media, where your name pops up on radio, on TV, in the major press and so on, as an expert, as an authority, indicator of your academic heft, if you will. Scientific blogging, which has become quite significant, quite serious in certain fields of scientific activity, and not to be sniffed at. And then this whole world of scholarly activity, the world of Mendeley and similar tools, which may not yet exist and may in the future. But as I said, one should be careful not to confuse liking, the ability to attract attention, the ability to stimulate interest, the ability to generate buzz from work that is truly scholastically significant and makes an enduring contribution. Acknowledgements, I've been working for more than 25 years, counting, doing studies and acknowledgement, and trying to have them introduced into the calculus of academic significance counting. Data citation count, micro-attributions, social media, all of these things are now fair game. We have the tool sets, or soon will, to capture most of these and to demonstrate just what kinds of impacts, what kinds of effects different scholars are having on these different different dimensions of scholarly activity and output. And we've gone beyond just counting citations to scientific papers to being able to count how frequently somebody is citing a particular chapter in your book. So the world of citation analysis and counting, which has not made a terribly strong impact on the humanities, may now become of more interest to humanistic scholars as individual impacts of chapters in individual books and begin to be monitored. The hunt for, well, I can show you that. The hunt for correlations, as Rachel said, my role as editor see every week, and I'm not exaggerating, 1 to 2 articles come my way, looking at correlations between different kinds of classical indicators and alternative indicators, or between different kinds of alternative indicators. This is the kind of question. What is, for example, the correlation between frequency of downloading of papers and the frequency at which those papers are subsequently cited? And these data, in the horizontal axis, you have the number of journals in each of these fields. So 300 medical journals and what is 20 or something decision science. But what you find is that in some fields, you have a near perfect positive correlation. In other words, the rate at which a paper is downloaded in some fields may well be an early predictor, a harbinger of its longer-term citation impact. The temptation will thus be to rely upon download data as presumptively indicative of future or lifetime citation rates. Trouble is, when you do different studies, you come up sometimes with rather different findings. Here we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different oncology journals, and instead of finding a near perfect line of regression, a clustering around it, we have a scatter, which suggests that not in all cases can we assume that frequency of download will in fact positively correlate with frequency of citation. And one could go on ad nauseam looking at the relationships, the associations, causal or otherwise, between these different indicators. Some of my colleagues at Indiana did this a few years ago, just looking at how Twitter mentions spark downloads from archive.org, for example. Now this raises, when you're on the Promotion and Tenure Committee, and as an academic dean for 20 years, I have seen my fair share, and a head of the department for 6 before that. So it's 26 years of assessing people for promotion and tenure in about a dozen different countries. And the question comes to mind, well, what's a citation worth? What's a publication worth? How do you determine equivalence? How do you take all of this stuff and reduce it? You couldn't, but people want to a single number, as it were, like the H-index, which is another flawed but very interesting indicator. So is this one citation from Jack worth 3 tweets from Rachel? And what sort of academic gold change are we going to need to be able to transmute these different indicators into some unitary measure, as well? So issues in general, I think, that we need to be wary of when talking about all metrics. The metrics themselves, I started off by saying that some are of questionable validity. What is the nature of the construct validity? How reliable are the data that we're working with? Do they actually have much value in use? And what about the ethical issues associated with using and basing decisions, career-related decisions, upon such indicators? And then we need to think a little bit about the platforms. Again, Rachel did hint that some may come, some may go. The site you like, I think, is they disappeared. Some come and some go. And there's no reason to assume that Google Scholar will be here in 10 years' time. There's no reason to assume that altmetric.com will be here in 5 years' time. And so we need, first of all, to think, how transparent do we actually know what is being counted and what the undergirding algorithm is that is producing the numbers that are being made public? And of course, as with the PageRank algorithm, people don't want, like the recipe for Cointreau. The monks aren't going to release it because it's Coca-Cola, it's a state secret, it's where the success lies. So people are not always going to be transparent. How easy is it to use the particular set of metrics in question? Is it worth the effort? Are they going to be there in 6, 10 months' time, 5 years' time, whatever? And what's the cost-benefit ratio between using these and the benefits that we derive? Very nice little report in the Netherlands a couple of years ago that really identified 2 major streams, 2 major, if you like, social consequences of the expanding use of these metrics. One is a growing culture of narcissism within the academy, and the other is a kind of Orwellian control mechanism being slowly put in place. The ego boosting, these numbers are absolutely meaningless. But my H-index, according to this, is 44. What does that mean? That I'm good, bad, and different? Well, you need to look at everybody else who does work very similar to mine. To do that, you need to find an individual. How would you compare somebody like Jacques here, who has this extraordinarily diverse set of academic interests. He doesn't fit in a box. He's going to be very difficult to measure, so he's obviously a nuisance, and we give him a low score. I didn't use ResearchGate, but since the day I logged on to look at it 4 years ago, I am bombarded with stuff like this. What is this? The question is not, the numbers are irrelevant. So whether I have 18 or 1,800 new citations, neither here than there. And they're going to tell my colleagues. It's playing to the individual's ego. It's locking you into, it's not exactly gaming, but it's the next best thing. I got this 2 days ago from ResearchGate. And they have a new measure, which you can go and read about, called READS. This is, it's like taking an academic's pulse. It's like the Financial Times Index. You can look at your stock rising minute by minute, day by day. And if I told you that people do, you would believe me, because people do in fact do this. It's a gross form of goal displacement that we are seeing throughout the academy. Mike Sosterick is a Canadian sociologist and wrote a lovely paper which he lambasted people like myself years ago. But he had done, this is before Altmetrics. This is simply the world of citation counting and citation analysis. And he said, what is being wrapped slowly around the academy is what he called an Orwellian surveillance net. We are able to see now at the flick of a switch how often somebody is being noticed, acted on, published, whatever it might be. And he used the term the cybernation of the academy, and it is well underway a decade plus later. So is there a kind of wrap-up sort of thing? Is there a kind of holy grail of policy? Is there a matrix? Will there ever be a fixed matrix of both established and emergent metrics? Could we come up with something, what I call a super H index, that weaves all of the traditional and all of the emerging metrics together to come up with a single bottom-line measure of how good you are, how useful you are, how meritorious you are in the academy? And this is a little thing I would probably redraft this. I did it some years ago in the early days, thinking, well, this is only illustrative. There are many, many, many other indicators. And some are scholarly and some capture social impact. Some are like pussycats, they're running around in feral mode, and others are highly institutionalized. Choose your rubrics, it's always that. What I tried to do was to put the different measures, the different indicators that we're using, established and trying to establish themselves, and illustrate where they are in terms of the structured acceptability, if you like, and their scholarly heft, and the extent to which they are still ill-disciplined and really capturing something other than pure scholarly impact. What I think, worst case in the Orwellian scenario, is that we will build a more complicated spider web than this one. I just took a few measures, the H-index, Facebook likes. So this could be blazed with X number of Facebook likes, X number of acknowledgements, X number of tweets, and X number of downloads. That could be my annual profile. Now imagine if every other academic in my department could be plotted in the same way. The dean, the director, has at his or her fingertips a way of visually comparing and making what would be horrendously suspect decisions. This, unfortunately, is, I think, the direction in which the academy is proceeding. And it happens because we are obsessed with atomizing, breaking apart, deconstructing contributions into a lowest countable unit. And it is a kind of fetishization of metrics, where this fascination with the newfound transparency is blinding us sometimes to the triviality of that which is being measured. And it's a sacrificing, back to Mr. Bieber and Mr. Beethoven perhaps, of immediacy, of iconicity, if you like, to canonicity. And looked at from a higher level, in fact, what I think we are witnessing is a kind of large-scale goal displacement. Many, many manifestos telling you how we should behave. Couple of books, you should have your own. And this has just been published by the Higher Education Funding Council in the UK, which they had set up a large committee to look dispassionately, objectively at the rising tide of metrics and the possible consequences of the academy. Fellowships coming out, lots and lots more papers, and one that's just been published. There we are. Thank you very much.
Alrighty. Okay, that was really good, and I did not expect that. Not that it wouldn't be good, I did not expect it to come from the direction that I thought was coming from. We had two really clear presentations, far more clarity than I think I've ever seen at a humanists conference, so maybe you information scientists that I'm in are onto something. So I was the understudy. I came in at the last moment, so I don't have the script. I'm very big on prezzies, and I would have loved to prepare a prezzie for you, but I only had about 72 hours to do this. So I'm going to speak from the heart, which is often the worst possible way to speak. A couple of things. We're talking about metrics. Your speaker failed trigonometry. I have a colleague who's a mathematician. That's impossible to fail. That's mathematics for imbeciles. Right? So I am afraid of numbers, and I thought I would have two speakers in front of me that love numbers and fetishize numbers. Quite the contrary. I think we're all reading the same stuff. Is the provost here? I'm just out of shit. Okay. I'm just very surprised by this turn of events, right? And the turn of events is making me very happy. So thank you to both of you for the clarity and for the brilliance. That's excellent. All right, so I'm going to start sitting on the University Committee on Rank and Tenure, and I'm also writing this book where I'm basically looking at the academy. I'm 49 years old. My view is the professoriate in the humanities in particular, as we know it, is done. It's finished, right? What we used to hold dear, the conventions of our guild, the professional setup and structure, all that is going the way of the petrodactyl, right? Now, it might be that at 50 universities, I think Georgetown will be one of them, we maintain these types of structures, but as for the other 4,000 schools in the United States, or something like 4,500 institutions of higher education, everything is going to change. And this was always seen as kind of a problem for the humanists, the Altmetrics, right? So I'm going to give you some off-the-cuff remarks in response to what my colleagues just mentioned. I'm going to start with a quote from Gramsci: "The old is dying and the new cannot be born." Right? Though somebody claimed it was actually Croce, and Gramsci stole it from Croce. This is why we need humanists to figure that out, right? I actually do think it's Gramsci. Metrics are built on fiction, which is really how I wanted to start all of this. And I love fiction. I'm a professor of literature. Right? What could be better than fiction? When I say metrics are built on fiction, I'm actually saying, and that's what life is built on, so let's not fetishize, again, the metrics. There's some texts I want to bring to your attention, and these texts, I feel, really get at some of our discomfort with the heavy use of metrics in tenure and promotion cases. The first is the inimitable Homo Academicus by Pierre Bourdieu, all right, which is a really, really important text where he speaks about scholarly tribes, all right, and this is, I think that thing was published 1988, 1992, right, in French, maybe a little bit earlier. He really gridded it out, all right, pointing out that there were these certain tribes within the French academic system, and they were citing one another and promoting one another and cross-referencing one another and putting one another on editorial journal boards, and you can draw the conclusions from all of that, how that will skew the metrics. The second was a book which had a lot less pop, but was quite interesting. It was Michelle Lamont's How Professors Think, where, and she really didn't want to say it. She was looking at how professors give out awards when there's a competition for an award. And it always seemed to turn out that there was horse trading and back channeling. I'll give you guys, you give me my guy. Got it? Good, right? There was a little fight, and then they had to resolve it, right? Fiction, everyday life, right? The opera of everyday existence. Then there's a book that is way too ballyhooed, Anthony Grafton's The History of the Footnote, right? I think the footnote is a very sensual, sexual, political thing, right? And this is what Grafton understood about von Ranke, for example, right, or Blumenbach, right, these kind of 18th and 19th century figures, but he simply refused to deal with what the footnote has become in the 20th and the 21st century. And what is the footnote is a very political sort of a thing, right? I wrote a piece in the Chronicle of Higher Education, had I my president and everything, I put it up. It was called The Crisis in Secular Studies. And I wrote a book called How to Be Secular, and an ideological adversary of my own, right, who shall remain nameless, wrote a book called How Not to Be Sexist. Okay, all right, take the hit. He never cited me. He never mentioned. So how is it even possible, right? So the point of the article was the field of secular studies is so characterized by internecine strife that you have these 2 or 3 camps and nobody cites the other camp, right? So the postmodernists, post-Foucauldians, post-colonialists, I call them Plomophoco, right? Refuse to cite anybody else in the field, right? So they started it, right? So there's a reaction by the classic liberals, think people like the great Noah Feldman at Harvard University, Martha Nussbaum, University of Chicago, but, well, we're not going to cite them either, all right? So the field is going nowhere, right? The field is absolutely clueless, right? And when people read, when policy analysts about 2 miles from over here are trying to understand what secularism is, they have no clue, right? Because the fields will not amalgamate and speak to one another. So please understand that about the footnote. A couple of other general observations, and then we're going to get to the metric that could not be discussed today, and that's teaching, because that is allegedly a very big part of how we promote folks at Georgetown University and other top 25 schools in the United States. A couple of factors that have come to my attention, my colleagues clearly know this. Self-citation, I'm very guilty of that. Men self-cite more than women self-cite, right? Which will skew your Google citation index, right? In the humanities, we're not like the social scientists, and we're not like anything else, right? If your Google citation index in the humanities is at 50 or 75 or 100, that's really impressive, right? It's not like these economists who I share a department with in the School of Foreign Studies, right, who are all trying to cram their knowledge into these 5 or 6 leading journals, right? So if you get your article into that journal within 3 years, you're going to have 100, 150 citations guaranteed, basically. Maybe I'm off, Professor Corman, you'll tell me, but I think you're going to have about 50 to 70. There are these like masterworks on obscure Russian poets, right, which will remain uncited for 10 to 15 years, right? But they are truly state-of-the-art works that nobody else could possibly do based on a quarter century of archival research in some godforsaken region of Belarus, wherever it might be, right? This is what the researcher did to produce that work. So this also cannot be measured by the metrics. I studied with Cyrus Gordon, who was a famous Semiticist who had cracked a lot of languages that nobody could really decipher them. Unfortunately, he also believed that the Phoenicians had gotten to Roanoke, Virginia. So that was a big problem in his career. He found the description. He actually believed it. They found the description was clearly a forgery, and he really dug in on that. What Cyrus Gordon said, I'll never forget this in graduate school, Cyrus Gordon said it takes 10 years for even the most highly visible scholars in ancient Near Eastern studies, right, to have an article or book noticed in the scholarly literature by other scholars. Now that was around 1990, he said that, but I think in the humanities, which moves at its own glacial slow pace, I think that's actually very true. It takes about 5 to 10 years for your work to circulate to about a dozen people. All right, now think about the 10-year window, all right, according to the AAUP in the 1940 statement, right, it's 7 years, right, so you get out of graduate school, fresh-faced graduate student, right, freshly minted PhD, right? You publish this brilliant article, right? In terms of citation index recognition, you're not getting it by the time you come up for tenure, which is another problem with using these types of metrics. All right, let's talk more about some of the personal, the fiction, the emotional, the drama. Here's a story from the front lines of biblical studies where I labored for a long time, and I no longer labor anymore. I'm very happy about that. I believe that scholars should be allowed to change. This is something I'm writing about in the book. Isn't that strange that people change? Who knew, right? People change, right? I'm just noting, if you become an associate professor, every associate professor is as unhappy as could possibly be. The Department of Higher Education has run story after story about the psychological depression, and I think I know why, right? Because they don't want to write articles about what they were writing about for the last 20. They want to do something different, anything, right? They want to branch into other fields, right? So I've left biblical scholarship, but I remember this very well. There was a canonical journal. It was our #1. It's called the Journal of Biblical Literature. And the Journal of Biblical Literature, because the field is so theological, was comprised, there was like, it's like the governance system of Lebanon, right? You have a Shiite prime minister, and you have to have, right, a Sunni such and such, and a Maronite this, right? It was this power sharing agreement where the editorial board, there was 2 or 3 representative Jewish folks, right? A couple of Catholics, a larger contingent of Protestants, and then acknowledging for right, maybe there was never a Muslim at that time, right? On the JBL, which was part of the problem, right? So what would happen is there was this nasty little core of researchers in biblical scholarship developing in the late 80s and 90s who were non-believers, all right? They were not new atheists. They were very respectful of religion, but they were just non-believers, all right? They didn't believe that the Bible was true. They studied the Bible as a work of literature. They studied the Bible as perhaps a historical artifact, right? But they didn't believe it was true. And what we all knew in the 90s is nobody at JBL, the canonical journal, would ever publish our research, right? And then finally another journal emerged out of nowhere. It was Sheffield, England. It was called the Journal for the Study of the Old Testament. And the Journal for the Study of the Old Testament basically saved biblical scholarship from itself, right? Because it was a journal that was willing to publish folks who were critical of the accuracy, integrity, so on and so forth of the Bible. Quranic Studies needs one of these as well. There might be one. I don't know what it is, right? There might be one that exists, right? But creating a scholarly apparatus for being critical but respectful of a religious text took a long time. And all those researchers who were trying to get their material published in the #1 journal knew, as Dante and as Weber said, lasciati ogni speranza, right? Abandon all hope, right? There's no way this journal is going to publish you. Fortuitously, because of the Journal for the Study of the Old Testament, things have changed. I really want to bring you down to the fictional level of scholarly existence in all this. Disciplinary differences. We talked about multi-authored pieces, right? This is all the rage in political science and economics now. In the School of Foreign Service where I sit, we have economists, political scientists over here, and we have the old school historians over there. The old school historians do not do multi-authored work, all right? I don't do multi-authored work, right? So when you look at the Google citation indexes, right, the person who's popping out 3 articles a year because there are 13 other contributors on that article, right, has a Google citation index that is going this way, whereas the person who is the mono-author is complete stasis for year after year after year after year. I would imagine information scientists and consulting companies hired by provosts at major universities are cognizant of this, right? But it really creates a tremendous difference in the citation numbers that you're going to use for a scholar. Gaming the system. And this I've seen speaking to graduate students. It's very clear that graduate students, this is all rational action theory, right? They have understood what's in their interests. They go to the path of least resistance, right? It might be in economics, many multiple authored articles. Hey, you bring your data set and I'll bring my data set and we'll slap an introduction on it and we've got an article. Now somebody is going to push back and say that's not how we do things, but I actually believe it is, right? When we write mono-authored pieces, we're alone, all right? It takes years to write a mono-authored scholarly article for a journal. Years, trust me. And from the moment you have the idea to the moment it gets published, on average, 5 to 7 years, all right? The old is dying and the new cannot be born. All right, a couple of other closing remarks. Heresy. Professor Cronin mentioned something about what this does to the process of thought. And having spent a part of my career writing about heretics, which is a subject maybe you can understand why I have an affinity for that, right? I wrote a book called Heresy in the University. It was about a professor who wrote this fascinating, his name was Martin Bernal. He recently passed away. And his theory was that the roots of Western civilization came from what he called Africa, right? Which would have been Egypt, and Egypt is certainly in Africa, right? But he really found a readership amongst Afrocentrists. This was in the late 80s. Some of you remember this. The book was a huge hit, sold 100,000 copies, was translated into a variety of languages. So the book I wrote was called Heresy in the University. And I was trying to understand, right, if the claims were true. There was a tremendous conflagration around this text. From about 1986 to 1995, it was one of the most discussed texts in the American Research Academy. It had supplanted Edward Said's Orientalism as the text that everybody was speaking about. And my conclusion was this, that there were certain fields that seemed built to strangle, murder, and mutilate the corpse of any type of innovative thinking, right? And the field that had to be blamed for that was classics, right? I mean, the classicists were so hostile to him, right? They lambasted him on the pages of the New York Review of Books. They ignored him in the scholarly literature. The name Mary Lefkowitz might ring a bell, or she wrote she wrote a book called Not Out of Africa, right? Which I think is sort of a laughable text 20 years on. She was over at Wellesley, I believe, right? So there was this kind of attack by the classicists on Bernal, who himself was a bit of a troublemaker, I have to say, and not always the most rigorous scholar, though then again it wasn't his field. He changed also. He was trained in Chinese political systems. He was a political scientist. He had a midlife crisis. He decided to write a book about Phoenicians and ancient Israelites, right? It's an important book in retrospect, right? I mean, it's a book that made certain claims about the way knowledge is produced, especially in antiquity studies. And his argument was there's a real racism there. There's a real anti-Semitism there, right? There's a real pro-Western bias there, and on and on and on and on. Eurocentrism. He went through it all. So what really worries me when I see this cavalcade of metrics, right, especially the idea that they're going to the provost, right, and they're going to the UCRT, right, is, well, what happens to the oddballs, right? And I always felt the university was sort of the home field for freaks and geeks. At least that's what it was when I got into it, right? It was just a place for strange people engaged in odd projects, right, who occasionally stumbled upon tremendous truths, right? So where did they go in this self-glorifying narcissistic system, right, where everything is reduced to a number, right, and how many other people might have cited you? All right, two final thoughts. Public versus scholarly work. In this book, Professed and Confessed, I make a claim. Every university in the United States says they value public scholarship. And every university in the United States is lying, all right? It is simply not true that in terms of tenure, right, universities respect and recognize anything but the type of scholarly materials we've mentioned today. Blogs are disrespected, tweets are disrespected, writing for the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times, disrespected, disrespected, disrespected. I defy anyone in this room to point to one tenure case in the United States where it can be proven it was a plus that the author published outside of normal scholarly fora. In fact, as I learned the worst possible way, having some type of engagement with the public is generally seen in the cloistered world of academics as a tremendous negative, all right, as a sign that you're not serious about the craft. So we have to think about these. We were looking at Facebook metrics and tweets and so forth. I really think a scholar has an interest in not having those metrics brought to the attention of the UCRT, brought to the attention of the provost, brought to the department chair, because they never work for you. Full stop. Anything else is a flat out fib. When you're a full professor, you do have that freedom, and people don't necessarily hold it against you, if only because there's nothing they can do about it. Right? You're bulletproof at this point. So full professors, blog your hearts out, write your op-eds, tweet every 15 seconds, all right? But I would never instruct an assistant professor to do that. It's a form of professional suicide, right? And it's terrible because there's so much to be gained for a public and for a scholar in terms of public engagement. I think the humanities are dying precisely because we closed in on ourselves and we lost our organic connection to a larger audience of cultivated laypersons. And here comes the second one, the hammer blow, to students. All right, and that's really where the defense of the humanities, I argue, begins in the classroom, not when you score the NEA grant, not when your article is accepted to 19th century studies and fiction. That's not the defense of the humanities. The defense of the humanities is what happens in a classroom with students. You're doing the humanities. Oh, we're reading Madame Bovary and we're arguing about it, really? You know, why did she do that at the end? What were the options available to women at this time? What did other writers happen to think about Flaubert? Why did Flaubert say Madame Bovary, c'est moi? Now you're doing the humanities, now you're defending them. All right, so let's just talk about teaching metrics, which is why metrics make me a little bit nervous. I've actually done real research on teaching metrics for the book, right? And something hit me. There are about 15 different metrics out there, all right, that universities are using to lionize, right, or celebrate the fantastic teaching by their faculty. I'm going to mention a few to you. I don't understand why this isn't even recognized, right? And they're completely different from one another. Retention rates. So we have studies that ask, if you took a class with Professor X, did you stay in the major or in that university? So that's seen as a metric of teaching excellence. The academically adrift study, right, which created such a ruckus for good reasons, I think, right? They're using this standardized, I think it's called the CLA, right? They're using a standardized exam which they're giving to students junior year or senior year. So you go to school, right? You study with your professors, then they give you this outside of exam, and they assess how good the teaching has been. And the answer is the teaching hasn't been very, very good at all, right? That's what academically adrift found. Student self-esteem, which is a thing, right? Did the students feel better about themselves after the end of the semester? That is a metric of, these are very different. Professorial self-esteem, right? Do the professors feel they did a good job? Which is almost always, yeah, I think, you know, I killed it, right? All right, so the final remarks that I want to make, and I really want to turn to this thing about teaching metrics, is all of this obsession, right, with the research metrics is bludgeoning, at least for those of us in the humanities, right? The real bigger problem, which is we do have a crisis of professorial, I should say, college or tertiary education teaching in the United States. Professors aren't teaching, all right? I wrote an unforgivable piece, apparently, in the Prezi I would have had ready for you. It was called Teach or Perish. And my argument was we have a very funny incentive structure in higher education. The bigger and better you get as a professor, the less you teach, all right? So the more you have a high citation index, your metrics are good, the more you can go to the dean and claim you need a year off, you need to do research, or you need to take yet another sabbatical, so on and so forth. It's very, very, everything seems inverted, right? To me, and maybe I'm old school, or maybe I teach at a Jesuit college, right, with a history of mentoring to students, or maybe I've understood something from that, right? To me, the bigger and better we get, the more we get to work with students, like freshmen, right, and sophomores, not just the elite kids on the senior level. I don't understand why I am in the minority, though I clearly am amongst my cohort, all right? So I have a statistic in mind. I think on every American college campus, there are some differences. There are some campuses that really have a culture of teaching. About 20% of your faculty is performing well by any metric in the classroom. All right, and I'm talking about tenure track and tenured faculty, right? Amongst the contingent, all right, which I'd love to have our my colleagues talk a little bit about contingent faculty and all of these metrics, because they don't have the time to do this sort of publishing. The number is closer to 40 to 50%. So I think a lot of contingent faculty, because they're hired on the basis of their ability to teach internal logic, internal philosophy, basic psychology, I think those fields, they're actually teaching our students, right? Whereas those of us who are chasing these metrics, right, kind of the self-fulfilling prophecy, we're chasing these metrics, and this is alienating us more and more and more and more from what we're supposed to be doing. I mean this for the humanists. I'll only speak for the humanists. We are supposed to be in those small classroom settings with our students, smarting them up. All right, last statistic of the day, and then we can begin what I think will be a very spirited conversation. There are two knowns in the science of academic teaching. There are two things we now know. All right, the data indicates we can say this, and it is true. All right, the first thing that we know is that small class size is extremely important. All right, after 25, that's the bad number. The good number is 15. After 25, you may as well have 25,000 people in that. It doesn't matter anymore because the professor can no longer engage in those conversations that are constitutive of a liberal arts education in a free society. 25, where the number I prefer is 15, right? 15 is like the golden mean for professors. 12 is also good, 10. Under 6, if you have an oddball student, everything gets so tinctured by the personality of the oddball student, right, that it can be a disaster. So I prefer 15. The second thing we are starting to learn has to do with active functions versus passive. The old lecture model, right? Show me the study, right? There was a piece in the New York Times by Molly Worth. Show me the study, since we're so data-driven, all right, that indicates the lecture model is working for this generation of learners, all right? I'm not saying never lecture. I sometimes lecture for about 20, 25 minutes at a time, all right? When I started my career, I lectured for 95% of the class, all right? Yesterday, we were working on John Updike's Terrorist. I spoke for about 35% of the class. That's the trend in American higher education. I'm convinced it's working. I'm not being paid to say that, right? I have no dog in this fight, right? I didn't sign a contract with the Active Learning Company. I don't have shares in this. I'm just realizing my students are much more invigorated by the fiction, and they're thinking very, very originally about it because I give them prompts in advance. Here are 8 questions we're going to discuss, and you're going to run with it. And don't dare walk in here not having read the text. They can't hide in a rule of 15. Right? So as a teacher, I feel this is really working. So let's think about those two givens: small class size, some form of active learning techniques. And let's ask ourselves how those cross-pollinate or don't cross-pollinate with our obsession with metrics. With that said, Artemis, I think I'm done. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much for that, Chuck, for that provocative presentation. Thank you all for your comments. And we're now going to enter the question-answer discussion phase of the program. I'm mindful of the fact that we do have our friends in Doha on camera. And if there are questions from Doha, how are those transmitted?
Tell them to chat the group.
Okay. Friends in Doha, chat the group with any questions you have, and Amy will alert us. Amy will alert us. No questions yet. So please, Carol.
I'm Carol Sargent, and I'm the director of the Office of Scholarly Publications, and I work with faculty here on book and article publication for tenure and promotion. And I hope that I horrify the whole panel when I say, maybe I won't, maybe you'll say it was inevitable, when I say that we play to these. And then we're actually having conversations about strategically citing into the world that you're going to go in. And we talk about their Google Scholar profile and these other things and say it's happening. You know, it's not something that you know, we can talk about whether we like it or not. It's really kind of there, and we don't really know what it means. It's we talk about how to cite strategically, and we cite strategically in two ways. One is by engaging in scholarly communication with people that you want to be involved with, because it's going to find them through their Google Scholar citation, right? So we already know you're going to pop up on their screen. Thinking about what fights you're picking, and also thinking about what alliances you're making, and then socializing it among the people who've been cited, usually positively, who then blog and tweet about it, because it's kind of funny, they will talk about themselves. And so we play to ego, but I try not to do it crassly, or I try not to suggest it crassly, because you can do it crassly, but I think it also smells like that. You know, I think there's a sense in which it can be perceived as such. But that there's a way to do this. And so we're getting an echo chamber effect, because if people are savvy and they're playing to it because they know it exists, and then it records them, you know, I'm not sure exactly what's happening, and I'm kind of what that means, but there is something that bothers me. I am morally disturbed by what I recommend, and I agree with that.
Are any of you morally disturbed by that? Blaze, I think you were pushing hard on this ego gratification.
Well, I'm amoral, and I don't. What else can I say? I have retired. I'm grateful to be out of the field. I endorse almost everything Jacques said. I find it deeply dispiriting seeing and despondent when I see the drift within the academy, the ineluctability of reliance upon measures. You said here that no one takes account of the public impact of work, but in the United Kingdom there is something called REF, the Research Excellence Framework, which is the latest incarnation of something that started, I went through the first iteration in 1985. Every 4 or so years, every academic in every department, in every university in Britain is assessed based on his or her output. And you're allowed to choose your, I think it's either 3 or 4 best pieces of work. That's to try and limit salami slicing. But in addition to that, this year, REF, for the first time, 20% of the allocation, the score going to an academic unit of the department. And these scores, by the way, it's a completely different centralized system. These scores drive funding from the center, research support funding, so they matter. 20% of the total score was going to public in wider social, I quote, wider social and cultural impact. And there were guidelines provided by the central government body as to what might be meant or understood by wider social cultural consequences. So academics were having to scramble to come up with putative indicators of ways in which their work were having resonance and ripple effects within the wider world. So here is an early case, albeit I have to say the British system does not yet rely upon citations and hasn't as yet anyway formally developed alternative indicators. It is at least going to force academics, to try and push the work outside of the academic theatre and into the wider public sphere, and forcing that, in a sense, by allocating 1/5 of the total score for evidence of that kind of broader social impact. Now, that can't happen in the United States because you have a federal system, and each is a rule unto itself. Nonetheless, my own institution, unless I'm mistaken, we do use altmetric.com data. I've learned at the provost office level, not just to see how we're doing vis-a-vis competitor institutions, and I use the word competitor advisor because that is partly the rhetoric du jour. And also, I'm told it is being used in identifying potential future hires. Difficult it is to do, as Rachel said, because in the case of citations, they don't mature, you don't reach the apogee for 2 to 3 years. So there's a lag, but people are now using it to try to use the language of 1980s Britain to pick winners. And this is a most unedifying epiphenomenon in the academy, arising directly from the gradual institutionalization of these tools and platforms. I say nothing at all about what Jack said about teaching. I've been revulsed in my 20 or so years as a dean, and it was always with graduate students. One simply knew, and I was a small unit, a small school, one simply knew who taught, who was a competent teacher and who didn't. You didn't need any of these things. And these self-serving, idiotic questionnaires that were used and which informed so much of the scoring that was done, really it's a traducing of the ethos and principles of the academy. Rant concluded.
Please.
My name is Claudia Holland. I'm from George Mason University, and I have been building on what y'all have said, as well as the influence of NSF to create a broader impact to receive grant funds. My question is, when units are doing PD, if it's at the unit level first, of course, why not require your faculty through discourse within your groups to provide evidence of impact in advancing the discourse within your discipline, or even in having an impact on the clinical, if you're in some sort of practical or applied field, and how your work has benefited humankind. I mean, why is it so hard to do? I don't know.
Just think about, I mean, let's look at the humanities where the gestation period is like 7 years, right, to produce something. But how do we measure? I mean, this is going to seem like an evasive answer to your question. I want to go back to this freaks and geeks remark, right? Because the one thing I forgot to mention were campus novels. Right? I'm a huge fan of campus novels. I'm even developing a course in them. And the greatest campus novel ever written is David Lodgett's, right? Campus Trilogy. We all know it, right? Why do we keep reading Mary McCarthy Groves of Academia? Why do we keep reading Randall Jarrett, Pictures from Miniature? I mean, there's so many of these, right? Even Tom Wolfe's excellent I Am Charlotte Simmons, which is about the students. All right. You're saying, well, what's this guy talking about, right? The type of person that gravitated to a career in the humanities, right? Rich, I think you're a little younger than the two of us, right? Maybe 30, 40 years ago, was just not built to think in terms of impact. It was a different mindset, right? It really was more geared to colleagues and students. There's research that indicates professors are moving further and further away from their campuses in terms of where they live, right? Whereas they used to just be on campus, there all the time. What was their impact, right? Their impact was just their life with the students, right? And their life with other professors. And yes, they did publish. I'm not one of these people that wants to say we should stop. Publishing is so important, right? But there was a life-work balance there, right? Wherein a scholar was expected to have some sort of humane engagement, primarily with students, right? And also with colleagues. Now, we know what human nature is. That's where the fiction was created, right? Because people are inherently evil, right? Or weird, right? And this is what created the fiction of being on a campus, where you take all these egos and all these oddballs, and you just put them in the same place, and they live together, and they deal with these students, bring them in, the next generation, right? And this was the impact, right? So now back to your question. I don't know how you measure humanities impact. How do you measure it? The last article I wrote was an article on Philip Roth, right? It came out 2 years ago in Philip Roth Studies, the premier journal for scholarship on Philip Roth, where I also happen to be an editor, but that's another gaming the system, right? How could I write up a report, right, to the dean of the School of Foreign Service, or even Chet Gillis, the dean of the college, right, that demonstrates or evinces the fact that this has had impact? Like 2 people actually cited it. I got a phone call from somebody who asked me so, and that's pretty typical for a humanist. In the next 10 years, 5 people will cite it. I think it's a very good article, right? But it's small. We're small. We're like microbrewers, right? I mean, we're artisanal, right? That's what we do as humanists, right? We create little things to be fed to students and colleagues that are around us. I'm very interested in what Rachel thinks. I'm just dying to know, as a, what are you making of the two of us who are like joined at the hip, right? We can finish each other's sentences.
Oh, you're a whipper.
I don't say I disagree with any of them. Anything that you guys have said, I think why I tend to take a more neutral tone is that ultimately I'm in the business as you are of helping my faculty. I have the ear of my provost, which is wonderful. He lets me talk to the new tenure track faculty on all of this stuff. And the more that I start to, opinionize and put myself into this, the less standing I have to serve as a neutral voice on campus. So I view my role as kind of providing the ground for people like you to discuss. And I can encourage, and one of my first thought was, that department should talk about how do they want to be measured?
Exactly.
Why isn't this written into their guidelines? That's one of my big things. Everybody should be having this discussion. Do we value the qualitative? I think there's still a big role for a qualitative review, that says something very real about impact. But if it's not written into how they're going to be evaluated when it comes to tenure and promotion, no one's going to do it.
The issue of gestation period is very important. I'm trying to. I think it was Hillary Putnam who wrote "Bowling Alone Together." Robert Putnam. Yeah, at Harvard. But if I remember correctly, there was muttering in Harvard Yard that he hadn't produced anything for ages, and perhaps he'd gone to sea. And then out comes this book. It doesn't just sell well. It doesn't just touch a nerve, but has him hired by Tony Blair and others as an advisor on public policy. Massively successful. And yet it took an awfully long time, and there was nothing happening in between. And even at Harvard, apparently, questions are being asked. So it's a huge issue of trust. And once upon a time, universities did hire and accommodate mavericks and eccentrics and all the others. And sadly, the number of geeks is going up, but I'm not so sure about the freaks and the mavericks and the genuine eccentrics. I'm the oldest in this platform. It's my only form of distinction. And as an undergraduate in the 60s at Trinity College Dublin, 4,000 students, professors from another age, no metrics, and utterly different. The rhythm of life was different. But there was a communality, a commensality. We were part of something. And this is not just rounding naivety and a love of the ancien régime. It's why has so much been lost so quickly? And why do we have to measure? Why do people have to be invited to come up with a mode of measurement? I was married to a humanist, a Spanish literature scholar for some years, and when the time for her tenure came up, there were no citations. She'd written the books and so forth. But it was all down to the letters, the people at Stanford and Brown who took the trouble to read her work. In other words, one relies upon people who know, who have engaged, and are prepared to take the time. And that is the culture that should be protected, not to be displaced by a culture of metrification.
Thank you for that. Before we go to this crowd, we do have a Doha question. And
hi everyone, it's here in Doha. My question is really to Rachel, and it's about the DOI. And is it possible to have a DOI allocated retrospectively, for example, for a working paper that I might want to self-archive on ResearchGate?
Ultimately, it's up to the platform on which it's published, but in theory, you should be able to apply a DOI to any point, any work at any point. I know libraries are increasingly getting involved with producing DOIs for their researchers. It's something that AU has only started to tackle in the past few months. But theoretically, yes, I guess is the best answer I can give.
Does everyone know what a DOI is?
It stands for Digital Object Identifier. It's a unique number that gets attached to a research work. So it's much easier to follow than, say, by article title, or particularly by author names, which can be misspelled and change over time, etc.
Thank you. Anyone in this crowd, please?
A series of remarks and possibly a question. I'm in the humanities, I'm in comparative literature and Italian. I totally, more than fully agree with the panorama that you offered of our situation in the humanities. Before this event, I was expecting that the people in the panel dealing with information science and with the more quantitative aspect of this experiment would go towards a more arid way of evaluating, more detailed and more arid, more technical. So in a sense, I am encouraged by your approach, all of you, in the sense that you seem to bring in more variables, a more holistic picture in this exercise that apparently we're all asked to make. What worries me then, taking into consideration what you all said, and again, this is the way in which people in all fields have to approach our situation in the humanities, is that apparently universities, in practical terms, are adopting much more arid ways of evaluating. I mean, in a sense, I would be partially encouraged if we were all evaluated by a platform that tries to take into consideration not only citations or presence in a certain journal in 10 months, but a wider picture. Apparently, at Georgetown, we are very keen on academic analytics, which, from the little I know, is, first of all, not transparent. Apparently, we don't even know how we are evaluated, who owns the data, what I would say the foundation is for a certain number that we are attributed. I don't know which journals are being considered. And just to tell you how numbers sometimes are odd, it looks like that our department in the last 3 or 5 years, as a whole, only produced 1 article. So even for people who are not very much number oriented, there should be some alertness here, right? So I see a gap between, in this desolating panorama that apparently you're all presenting, and so you do not endorse it, there is also a wider gap between what in theory Altmetrics could do and what in practical terms boils down to, if we are evaluated with an instrument of that kind, we are very, very far away from a possible target in terms of objectivity, etc. Not to mention the gap between the scientific field for which all this was born and the humanities, which again beg for an alternative way in terms of evaluation. So I don't know what you have to say about academic analytics and what Professor Berliner-Grau presented, which is really the way to picture the humanities.
I mean, my first thought is the big voice that's missing on this panel is the administrative voice.
Right.
And I think they would be able to speak to what value they find in academic analytics and what kind of process they go through when thinking about the benefits and limitations of such a product. We actually at AU also use academic analytics. I have many of the same questions, but I can also tell you that faculty weren't involved in that decision to purchase and use that product. So I personally don't think I'm the best person to talk about that product because I have nothing to do with it.
So who can say something? There is a big gap, any information scientist, can we as humanists say that maybe there isn't one size that fits all? Because not only in terms of productivity, but also in terms of output. An article after 4 years of painstaking work, then you wait for 3 more years for the article to come out, or 3 years, and so your tenure line is over. A book review, I wrote, this is the most blatant case, I wrote a book review in 2000, I lost track of the year when I wrote it. It comes out in a major journal, but what is the impact? It's a book review about a book and an event that took place 4 years ago, and I received the proofs last week.
I think that illustrates one of the, in terms of the cycles and the speed at which different fields move. I know firsthand publication cycles in many humanities fields are as painfully slow as you describe. But historically, in, for example, physics, the reason a journal called Physics Letters A and B is produced is to accelerate it. And the reason we have archive.org, physicists now put many physicists, not all, put their work first up there before, where it'll be widely read. And it is also, you get 2 citation cycles. Once it's on archive.org, you'll see a citation curve. And then many of those articles will appear in the Physics Journal of Record, and you'll see a second curve. But the point is they are getting time to market, to use the language of business, is dramatically shortened, and not yet in the humanities. And that's an oversimplification. That is one of the problems. So you have this problem, but the tool sets that are being used are not cognizant of or don't bother, are not designed to take account of, if you like, the differentials in the rhythms of life in the different fields.
We have time for one more question. Jennifer?
I think one of the things that haven't really been addressed, and one of the reasons why Altmetrics has been created, is because of the disaggregation of the journal. That articles from a certain journal aren't always indicative of that are not always used because that is the journal of record. That there's more and more multidisciplinary research, and there's much more, scanning across the discipline to find these articles. And sometimes it's not an article. Sometimes it is a digital object. Sometimes it's a scholarly website. And so I think there's still very much a need for these altmetrics because of the many different forms of scholarship that is being discovered and used in distributing information. But I want everybody to know, for faculty in this room, that it is not your tenure, and John can attest to this, your tenure is not based upon these numbers. There's still a review. A packet is still sent out. Your committee, your chair, your department is still voting on you. There is still the tenure review committees. So these numbers are important, but they are not all that important. And I was wondering if you'd like to talk about that to make it doesn't sound so desperate.
This is my first go on the UCRT, but one thing I've known about the committee, right, is they really read, right? And everyone says, don't sit on this committee, right? It's just going to colonize your life. You'll have no free time, which I thought was a really good, and I wanted to sit on the committee for the book I'm writing. Obviously not to write about the cases, but just, just to see the end point of the process, right? Which is getting a doctorate. And I'm very interested in the humanities cases. But in the defense of the UCRT, and I believe this to be true, right? It's just known as a committee where they read painstakingly everything. Right? So we're happy about that. On another note, and this is Georgetown after all, I want to say something. I want to push back a little. The way we understand it, the humanist professor, you're with us, just so you know. You're not neutral. And I would ask a call of conscience to every librarian in this room, we're your people. Just that's all I'm saying. The second thing I want to say is we're not giving at Georgetown enough credit and respect to the Jesuit tradition, all right? And I'm a secular Jewish person, all right? Also SJ, right? This is a tradition that saw us through 225 years, all right? It's a tradition which is very consonant with what we do, this type of one-on-one, right? Discussions with students in small settings. And I feel if we're going to get our groove back, right, as a university, right, we're not Harvard, we're not Yale, we're not Penn, we're not Stanford, right, we're not Chicago. The Chicago has that. University of Chicago has always had gurus on its face, really wacky professors that attract students, right? We're going to get our groove back, right? I think the way forward is greater thought about what the Jesuits had been telling us, right, about how you educate a human being. I really, really mean that. And again, I have no dog in this fight, not paid by or the Jesuits, right? I come from a different intellectual and theological realm, right? But I think it's a very good system, and we need to kind of bring it back as we think about how we're going to promote our faculty. Did they do right by the Jesuits? Not theologically, right? In terms of what we say are our values. If you walk around our campus, by the way, you see these beautiful signs, right? I believe them, like Cura Personalis, right? Men and women for others. We believe this stuff, or I think we believe this stuff, right, as an institution. And I want the humanists here to say we live by these ideas because they're fundamentally good ideas. So,
a fitting conclusion. How about a big round of thanks for our panel? Lots of things to nibble on and to drink. Please help yourselves. Artemis Kirk, thank you and your staff.
Thank Meg Oakley and the Scholarly Communications Committee for this wonderful, wonderful program. Thank you, Meg. Thank you, everyone.
same reason I didn't start reading Philip Roth until 3 months ago. And I read